All right, so my name is Jesse, and we are back with another interview for Conservation Stories Canada. Over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of working with a great many pollinator people and pollinator groups across the country, and pretty much universally, the person they say is the best person to talk to is who's joining me today, Dr. Sheila Colla of York University in Toronto. Her website is savethebumblebees.ca. On Twitter, she is @SaveWildBees. She lives and breathes this topic, and it's a really one that a lot of people are really excited to learn more about. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Colla. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's dive in. What are some of the threats facing wild bees? What are the things that they're in trouble because of?
Okay, well, that's a great question just to start off on, just a little bit of everything. I would say one of the main threats is the fact that people just don't understand what's going on with bees and conservation right now. And what I mean by that is there are over 850 species of native bees in Canada, and there is not a single threat or thing that we can blame for the decline. And not all of those bee species are in decline. Some are actually doing really well. Some are actually expanding their native ranges. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on right now. And yes, some species are at risk of extinction, and those are the species that I work on, particularly bumblebees. And for those ones, climate change and the introduction of diseases from managed bees seem to be probably the most important thing, but also probably habitat loss and pesticide use.
Yeah. So it really runs the gamut. I mean, that's a wide array of threats. It's not something that can be solved very easily. What do we stand to lose? So if we lose these native bees, if we lose bumblebees in particular, what's the impact to us and what's the impact to ecosystems?
Yeah, so it's one of those things. It's a little bit hard to test. People are working on these things, but there are some important things to think about when we're talking about native biodiversity, especially things that pollinate our plants. So in terms of our agricultural production, when studies look to see if native bees are doing some pollination, they actually are, even if you have managed bees in the system. In general, pollination is much better if there is an abundant and diverse community of native bees and other pollinators. When you talk about food security, food sovereignty, those kinds of things, native bees are really important because not everybody has the time or space or resources to have their own honeybee hive. And a lot of our native plants, which are culturally important medicinal plants for indigenous communities, have co-evolved with our native bees and pollinators. So they can't just be replaced. And then when you're thinking about climate change going forward, we've always known for decades now that the more diverse a community is, the more resilient it is to perturbances. So any sort of threat that comes in, the more species you have, the better you're going to be, more resilient you're going to be going forward. So with climate change, we know we're going to have a whole bunch of new things coming in, a whole bunch of new things happening. So having as many species of native bees as possible means that our wildflowers and our food will get pollinated as far as we know right now. I guess that sums it up.
I'm really glad you touched upon the fact that biodiversity in and of itself is something that's really valuable to an ecosystem, really valuable to an area. I just first heard you touch upon that, so thank you so much. So, this is what we stand to lose. How are we doing? Your work touches upon bringing together government, community stakeholders, university researchers, and more to sort of push forward these conservation policies. How is Canada doing in terms of protecting bees? Now that we know this is a big issue, now that we're working towards it, are we succeeding? Are we getting worse by the minute? What's going on?
I would say we are not doing a great job. And this is sort of why I've had to change my research area a little bit. So I was trained as an ecologist, and I thought, collect the data, produce the right information, tell the government what to do in terms of the threats, and it'll all happen. But the reality is conservation issues are like a social problem, right? So it's not just about me collecting the right information and data. There's people, there's power, there's different lobby groups involved and all this kind of thing. So while I was the first to detect the decline of the endangered rusty patch bumblebee in a quantitative data way, the message of Save the Bees has really been co-opted by organizations, people making money in a variety of ways. So now the message is completely lost. So the fact that the endangered rusty patch bumblebee has most likely declined because of an introduced disease from managed bees has actually led to more people wanting managed bees because that's how they think they're saving the bees. So it actually becomes this like whole social problem that I need to disentangle before I can even communicate the scientific issues around the issue.
So there's been a lot of greenwashing. I mean, this is something where a lot of people, when they think about saving bees, they think of honeybees. This is what's depicted in a lot of advertisements. So this is totally wrong. We want to denounce this outright, or where do we stand with how sort of it's been marketed in terms of saving wild bees?
Yeah, it's a little ridiculous, to be honest. It would be like if you wanted to save the birds in the forest, you threw in a bunch of chickens, or if you wanted to save the fish of the Great Lakes, you threw in a bunch of Asian koi. It doesn't make any sense. But for some reason for bees, because of that narrative and the strong lobbying that's going on behind it, the message has been totally lost. So it is definitely a problem. And the fact that the honeybee industry does have things that impact their ability to make money, to be profitable. And beekeepers are struggling in a few ways because they bring these hives into degraded habitats, which use a ton of insecticides, things that are like specifically formulated to kill insects. Honeybees happen to be insects. So yeah, pesticide issues are the most important problem to honeybee hives and forage habitat because honeybee hives are huge. They take millions of flowers to be able to create honey. So yeah, these are the two most important things for honeybee hives. But when you buy bee condos and put them on your roof in the city of Toronto, you're not helping the bees. You're introducing an invasive species, which probably has diseases, which very well could go in and impact our native bees and kill them without us even realizing it. So it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And I've been really thinking about how we can get back to connecting with our native biodiversity and wanting to protect what should be here and what we need to be here for all those other reasons we mentioned before.
Well, so that's kind of discouraging, I've got to say. As someone who knows that the scale and scope of this issue, so what can we do? If you're watching this, if I leave this broadcast, what can I do to actually help wild and native bee species?
Yeah, so the first thing is probably communicating. We did a cross-country survey that was just published last year, and we found that over 50% of Canadians named the European honeybee as a native wild species to Canada. So even just like telling people that wasps and honeybees are not native bees, you're probably gonna like blow people's minds. And that's actually one thing that I really like about my work, because I can go and give talks to naturalist groups, and very few people realize we have hundreds of native bee species, and they all do different things, and most of them don't sting. Many of them are different colors, like green and blue and silver. They're not all these yellow, black striped things. None of them make honey. Almost none of them live in hives. Like all the things that we're taught to think bees do are actually completely inaccurate and incorrect when you're talking about Canadian bees. So that's number one. Number two is participating in citizen science programming like Bumblebee Watch, which we have. It's a free app and website. So that actually helps us a lot because with that, with those photos that people submit to us, we find populations of rare species. We learn more about what the bees are feeding on, where they're living. So we can collect historical data and see how over time populations are changing. And we're tracking invasive species with that as well. And then the third thing is planting native plants and encouraging your policymakers or what have you to plant native plants where possible and limit managed bees in areas that don't require managed bees.
Very cool. That was a lot. It's so exciting to get the many different solutions people can take. So we're going to link in some of those at the end of the broadcast. People can check out those resources. Amazing organizations like Bumblebee Watch, which I did bring up on the screen on the bottom right now as well. So you're obviously a super huge fan of native bees and bees in general. What is one thing you can leave us with that the general public might not know about bees that is just particularly mind-blowing, particularly exciting to you personally?
Oh gosh, okay. I mean, everything I've said is mind-blowing so far, I'm sure. Yeah, I guess it's just that like the honeybee is not a native bee, and none of our native bees make honey because our native bees sleep over the winter and they don't need food for the winter. So that's probably one of the most mind-blowing things that I tell people. But once you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that does make sense that most of our other animals sleep during the winter, so as do our native bees.
So I have to follow up with one last question before I wrap up. Where do they sleep? Are they hiding inside tree bark? Are they burying themselves underground? Is it a mix of everything?
Yeah, I guess it depends. There's a lot of different species. In terms of bumblebees, they tend to be underground, maybe like in compost piles or under mulch or rotting logs. The queens kind of dig in there and they overwinter alone. And yeah, inside different stems. So that's why people say like don't clean up your yard over the winter and stuff, because there's native bees that do nest inside stems, like raspberry stems and things. So yeah, keeping things messy is also really helpful.
Thank God I finally have an excuse. Excellent. Thank you. I'll take that from you. I'm doing it for science, like I said. Sheila Colla, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate this. I think this is a beautiful start for people to learn a little bit more about bees, why they're so important, and what they can do to help. So thank you again.